My name is Keith Bybee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture in the 1L Convocation Lecture Series. As you know, this lecture series is organized by Dean Arterian and myself with an eye towards scheduling speakers that are of interest to the university community, but also of particular benefit to the 1L class at the College of Law. This search for speakers often takes us far afield. We bring in people from different parts of the country, but this same search can also return us much closer to home. And that's where we find ourselves today. We will have a presentation by faculty members at the College of Law, Professors Paula Johnson and Janis McDonald. Professors Johnson and McDonald are co-founders of the Cold Case Justice Initiative. Through a College of Law initiative and university support, Professors Johnson and McDonald and their students investigate unsolved murders from the civil rights era. Their work is both interesting and extraordinarily important, and it's a privilege to have them here today. The title of their lecture is "The Past is Not Past: Essential Lessons of the Civil Rights Era Murder Cases in Law, History, and Society." Before I turn over the podium to Professors Johnson and McDonald, I want to just remind you a little bit about the format here for the Convocation Lectures. Ask now that you turn off all your mobile devices so that the presentation isn't interrupted by any ringing or alerts. I'll also remind you that the lecture will go on for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for question and answer with the audience. We'll have a few people roving with wireless mics, so if you have a question, please just raise your hand during the Q&A period, and we'll find you. These lectures are taped, so when you speak into the microphone, it not only amplifies your voice for the purposes of the audience and the speakers, but also helps us record it for the video. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professors Johnson and McDonald.
Good afternoon, everyone. We want to thank you all for coming out to this convocation this afternoon. I'm Professor Johnson, this is Professor McDonald. Believe it or not, people do sometimes get us confused. We were realizing earlier today, actually before today, but we were talking about it today, that we've been doing this work now for going on 5 years. In some ways, I suppose that's a testament to the doggedness of the enterprise, but in some ways it's also a very sad commentary on the fact that the work needs to be done, and that when we put it in perspective, the 5 years that we've been doing this work in comparison to the 45 or 55 years in which these crimes remain unsolved, again, is something of a sad commentary on the state of justice, and particularly racial justice in this country. So we have titled this talk, "The Past is Not Past: Essential Lessons of Civil Rights Era Murder Cases," because we think that the work that needs to be done because of these murders, because of the reasons for the murders, and the fact that they remain, or so many of them remain unsolved, has lessons for us not only in the profession, but also for the larger society. And for those of you who are first-year students, we think that there is no sooner time for you to be involved and aware of these issues that pertain to law and to society, and what kind of profession you want to enter into, what kind of professional you want to be, what kind of citizen you want to be, and how these cases may have some reflection on those issues for you and for all of us. So we would like to start then with the presentation. I don't know, would you like to say anything?
Well, I'd just like to recognize that we have 1Ls who have volunteered and they'll be speaking a little bit later, or at least a representative of them. But I just wanted to let you know that some of them are in the front row here. They have, even during your 1L year, you are welcome to volunteer, and we've had some great efforts already and look forward to more. Go ahead.
Okay. So let's begin. We want to talk about the work that we do. First and foremost, we do this work on behalf, whoops, make sure this doesn't advance faster than I want it to. We want to make sure that you understand the role of family members in this work. And some of you may be familiar with the Emmett Till case. Any of you familiar with at least the name Emmett Till? What happened to Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955? 14-year-old youth, young person who was killed in a very heinous way in Money, Mississippi, where he was dragged from his bed because he allegedly had whistled at a white woman in a store. His death was something that really brought national and international attention to the issues of racism in the United States, and the fact that this killing would have happened with impunity, but for the fact that his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, she had since remarried, so Mamie Till Mobley had insisted that his casket remain open. Now let me tell you that the next slide is very graphic, and it was a picture taken at his funeral service in Chicago, where there was an outpouring of the community, again, national and international people from the community and from the worldwide press who attended this. This was after the officials in Mississippi had tried to bury his body very quickly without any kind of ceremony, without any kind of funeral, and Mrs. Mobley and many of the other activists insisted that the state of Mississippi have to stop. She had said, no one gave permission to bury my son. And what they wanted to hide, of course, was how atrociously he had been treated. This young man, this 14-year-old black youth, had been beaten to the point of being almost virtually unrecognizable. And then his body had been dumped in the river tied to an engine combine. And the state wanted to hide all of this. And so she insisted that the world see, and that is what she said, the world has to see what happened to my son. So let me just warn you that the photograph, which was a Jet magazine photograph, Jet magazine being one of the premier black publications, particularly at this time, Jet and Ebony magazine, one of the only publications to provide information about these kinds of events happening in the United States. And so Jet published this photograph of, down. Okay, well, you don't have your own equipment. So this is Emmett Till's battered body. And this is what Mrs. Till wanted to say. I wanted the world to see what they did to my baby. And so there was outrage after this, but of course the racism didn't stop and the racist killings didn't stop. But it did galvanize the community, and there was a lot more attention to these issues. But I say this also to say that it has always been the families who have insisted that the world, that government officials, that the entities and the apparatus of society and government and law enforcement take notice of these events, that the lives of their loved ones, of their children, matter, and that they matter in the places where other people's lives matter. And that is the work of CCJI as well. So we follow really direction from the families. We ask them, what do they want to see happen? And to a person, they always say they want justice. They always say they want some acknowledgement that these harms have occurred. Some acknowledgement that when law enforcement could have paid attention and could have done what they should have done in terms of investigating or prosecuting these cases, that they did not. And in many instances, they even colluded with people who did commit these acts, and sometimes they themselves were participants in it. So this is what the families want. Now, here is another family member, again, in talking about what the families want, and they want justice, and that's defined differently for many people. But this is a man named Thomas More, holding the picture of his brother Charles More. Charles More with a friend, Henry Hezekiah D., were both from a little place called Meadville, Mississippi. And in 1964, they were hitchhiking along the highway. And some members of the Klan thought that they were part of an insurgent group bringing arms into the county. And so they kidnapped these two young men and tortured them and took them across the Mississippi River on the Louisiana side and the Mississippi side until frightened and badly beaten, they simply told these Klan's members what they wanted to hear, although they had nothing to do with what they were supposedly accused of having done. So they were killed in a similar fashion to Emmett Till, in fact. And their bodies were found in the National Forest in Mississippi, a place called Homachito National Park. But here is Mr. Thomas More, who had served in the military. In fact, he was in Vietnam at the time that his brother and his friend were killed. And when he came home, people didn't want to talk about what happened. They didn't want to talk about exactly what had happened to his brother. There was a whole hush-hush aspect to this, not only in the white community, but also in the black community. And you can understand why people would be reluctant to say anything, while everyone knew it was a very suspicious killing. But Thomas More made a vow to his brother that he would seek justice, that someone would be held accountable for his brother's death. And he kept that promise because he was the one who went to the U.S. Attorney in Mississippi. He was the one who insisted that they continue to investigate this case many years afterwards. And there finally was an indictment, and in fact, there finally was a conviction. It's one of the cases where there was a conviction of Klan members, at least one in this case, held responsible for committing this crime. But one of the things that Mr. Moore says, and we have brought him here to the school a couple of years ago to speak to our students and to our community, and he said that when the grand jury indicted the defendants in this case, a man named James Ford Seale, that is when he began to heal in this case. So the families are well aware of what it means to pursue justice, what the steps are in that pursuit, and the significance of every aspect of it. And so these are the folks that we work with. Now let me just go through a few slides quickly and give you some sense of, for instance, this one, sort of open, as we say, sort of open and notorious way in which the Klan has operated in U.S. history, to the point of putting posters like this up and around, anywhere, inviting people to join them. And so much of this happened without any response, any official response from U.S. government. So how we got started working specifically with families or working directly with families was on a case involving the death of a man named Frank Morris. Frank Morris was a 51-year-old black man, shoe shop owner in Faraday, Louisiana. Again, another little town in Louisiana. Actually, Professor McDonald had been doing some research in the area on another subject having to do with the slave trade from Louisiana to Maine. And she ran into someone who had a connection with doing some local history on issues of some of the unsolved cases. And in the course of that conversation with a journalist named Stanley Nelson, She was put in contact with Rosa Morris Williams, who was the granddaughter of Frank Morris. And Mrs. Williams wanted to know what happened to her grandfather, because the case had never been solved. December 1964, never been solved. And so from that point on, when Professor McDonald and I agreed that we would work together on this, we have never looked back. We started with the Morris case, and as our work increased and people became more aware of what we were doing, more and more families came to us. And with our volunteers as well, as we began delving into some of the information and the research, we began to look at things that just kind of piqued our interest. And as we read blurbs sometimes, no more than a quarter of an inch in a newspaper, we would say, something strange or something, very suspicious about that. Maybe we should look into it some more. And that's what we have done, and that's another way in which our cases have grown. So we started with Frank Morris, and here is an image of Mr. Morris inside of his shoe shop. And he was a very interesting figure too, because again, this was a time of segregation. It's kind of while officially outlawed by the 60s, it still was something that was widely practiced and part of the culture and custom in the United States, and particularly in the Delta South, but not just in the South, in the North as well. Mr. Morris was unique, though, at least somewhat different, in that all people were welcomed into his shop. And all people were respected in his shop. And he was somebody who was well respected in the community. And often people have asked us, why do you think Frank Morris was killed? They come up with lots of theories. Was he involved with white women? Was he doing something? Did he rub somebody in law enforcement the wrong way? Why was he targeted for his shop to be burned to the ground the way that it was? And there is no other answer for that other than Frank Morris was Frank Morris and who he was. A man who had self-respect, a man who had his own livelihood, who had skills, a man who was respected widely throughout the community. That was simply enough for his life to be at risk, and it was. So this is what happened to him on December 10th, 1964. When some two men came to his shop and poured a flammable liquid all around the circumference and burned it down. Now Mr. Morris, was able to get his grandson out and another worker who were in the shop, but he was not able to escape. And he suffered third-degree burns over 90% of his body. And he sort of lingered and languished in that pain for about 4 days until he finally succumbed, and then was not able to name the person who was responsible for his death. And we don't know if it was because he was afraid to name the person. We seem to think he might have known the person, might have recognized them, but he did not or could not say the person's name. And so this is a case that we continue to work on and make progress with. This, you see, is the charred remains of the building after the fire. So Frank Morris is where we started, and Professor McDonald is going to continue and tell you something about some of the people we work with in this work.
When we started, first of all, it was absolutely amazing how much response we got from law students here in the law school, because the word got out. We both taught criminal law at the time. We talked with some of our students. We taught constitutional law, and Professor Johnson taught voting rights. And our students said, we want to help. Can we help? What can we do? And so we started right away that first spring, and then in the summer of that year. And we were working with people like Stanley Nelson, he has a weekly newspaper, it only comes out once a week, in Faraday, Louisiana, lived in that area all his life. He was 9 years old when Frank Morris was killed. But when he found out that Frank Morris was killed in his community, he wanted to know why. And as a reporter, he wouldn't let it go, and he still won't let it go. And we have worked, one thing we have to learn is how, as lawyers, law students and lawyers, to work with journalists. Sometimes they don't trust us, and lots of times we don't trust them. But when you can work together and share information and go back and forth, it's terrific. And so in our situation, he said, I don't know what to do. I can talk to the people on the ground, but I don't know the first thing. You're talking about House Un-American Activities Committee reports and other kinds of documents that the FBI has. How do we collect them? How do we do this? So we started together. We'd find things, and this one. We'd find things, and then he would find the people in the community. Then we would find some more documents, and then he would find more people in the community. Other collaborations with journalists, Jerry Mitchell, who's won a MacArthur Fellowship just in the last couple of years. Stanley Nelson just was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, a finalist for the work he's done with us in this last 5 years. But Jerry Mitchell from the Clarion Ledger in Mississippi has done a lot of work in revealing some of the other cases. He's contributed a lot of research to the 3 civil rights workers who were murdered in 1964. Now, that's another power of students, because in 1964, 1963, 1961, we're on the 50-year anniversaries these years of ours right now, but students came from colleges all over the country, and they came into the South, and they helped to register voters, and they risked their lives, and they worked with the families and the people in the community to find information and to help with the civil rights cause. Family is, as Professor Johnson mentioned, absolutely critical. We take our lead from the families, and one of the things as law students we need to absolutely remember when we get caught up in all of this legal stuff we're learning is that we need to listen and respect the people who have fought so hard for their own rights. They can take the lead in many, they have been. We're latecomers to this. We've only been working on this for 5 years. They've been working on it in some cases for 50 years, for 40 years, and what they want, as Professor Johnson said, is some kind of justice. These are some of the pillars of the community in Faraday, Louisiana. The person on your right is the Reverend Robert Lee, Sr. He is now 95 years old, and I remember being in his presence the first time I met him, and my son was with me, and he pulled out his 1946 laminated voter registration card. Now, what you have to understand is how much of a death sentence it was for someone in 1946 in Faraday, Louisiana, to register to vote. But he did. And he carried that thing with him. He still carries it with him. And he handed it to my son, and he said, I did it for you and for everybody else. You need to vote all the time. This is his son, who's a principal in the community. But when you go to Faraday now, you still see a white high school and a black high school, white elementary school and pretty much a black elementary school. It's still a community that has a lot of challenges, and they're right in your face when you're there. We've had collaborations with the Department of Justice and the FBI, and sometimes they call them collaborations, and sometimes they look at us like, oh my gosh, they're here again. Because one of our jobs is to push them to do their jobs, so that we have, from the beginning, we contacted the FBI agents. Actually, when we started the Frank Morris case, there was no FBI agent assigned to that case. It was listed as a very cold case. And it would still be listed as a very cold case, but for the work of our students and Stanley Nelson and the Cold Case Justice Initiative, pushing it forward. So we've worked with the FBI agents. We eventually, day after Christmas, had a 7-hour meeting with this gentleman, Donald Washington, who is now the former U.S. Attorney from the Western District of Louisiana. We convinced him that we presented the facts that we had found so far. He took us seriously. He started to move forward on the investigation into the Frank Morris case, and we started asking him questions about some of the other murders that we'd heard about in that area and that needed investigation. So as lawyers, we didn't officially have the position to prosecute these cases, But it's our job as lawyers in society to be the agents to insist that the rule of law be respected, that it doesn't matter if it's 50 years since the person was murdered or 40 years. Murder has no statute of limitations. And what kind of society do we want to be when we just bury it? And as lawyers, we're the ones that have to push that kind of insistence. So that's me surrounded by the FBI. That was kind of intimidating, but those are all FBI agents and Department of Justice folks. We also collaborate with other kinds of specialists. So I found myself on my birthday one year in the swamps around Faraday, and they were saying, well, there are rattlesnakes around here now, you just watch your step. And with Dr. Mary Manheim, who's called the Bone Lady, and she reconstructs, she sees the television kind of things of this kind of reconstruction and identification of remains that are found in the forests. And we were looking for the particular remains of an individual who disappeared. And it's sometimes you can laugh about it, but it was very serious. Here we are as law students and lawyers out actually looking for the evidence of somebody's remains. And in that case, we collected DNA, and we gave her the family members that she could match it to, and they've collected a database of DNA to match with the many remains that are sometimes sitting in a medical examiner or a coroner's office. And in 1964, the medical examiner wasn't a medical person. It was just Joe Jones who was appointed, and some of the remains are still in their houses or in the sheriff's department. And so that is a project that we're pushing. So we want to talk about some of our goals, so Professor Johnson will do that.
Yeah, so I think I've already alluded to many of them, but specifically, these are the things that we would like to accomplish with this project. We want to make sure that the victims, those people who have been slain, their families, and the communities receive some justice, that we assist them and work with them in those pursuits. One of the things that's important, as we were just showing you the slide of the community collaborations, is that, these were friends and neighbors, the people who were killed in these, horrible manners, they were parts of the community. And so it isn't just the immediate families who have suffered from the losses. In some cases, people were killed in these ways in the middle of the community. The bombing of Warless Jackson Sr., for instance, in Natchez, Mississippi. Bomb was timed to go off in the middle of the neighborhood. So that wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his family. That was a message for the entire Black community. And so this work involves much more than just the immediate family members. So we work with and on behalf of all of those folks. What we also tried to do and tried to model in the work in CCJI is collaboration and cooperation between the faculty. So Professor McDonald and I, for instance, bringing to bear our overlapping interests and the differences that we have, some of which might be obvious, some of which may not be so obvious. But we always address these things directly, and we make sure that our students have to address them directly as well. We can't be about the work of doing anti-racist work and not talk about racism, and not talk about other issues, isms, other types of subordinating behavior in the U.S., issues regarding sexual orientation, issues regarding gender, issues regarding class. It's all of a piece. No matter how distinctive these issues might be, they are all of a piece, and it brings to bear the question for all of us, what kind of society do we want? And how do we as lawyers make sure that those things change? We also want to make sure that there is an appreciation for what the students do, that students who say they want to volunteer with CCJI, and as Professor McDonald said, there was a groundswell of response when we first started doing this work, and students have continued to volunteer over the years. We want to make sure that those students are not only interested, but dedicated and responsible to the work that we do. We don't want to make promises to the families that we can't keep. So just a quick word about stuff that we do, and maybe we'll have some of the students go through some of this in terms of the different aspects of what we do, certainly legal theory and doctrine, but some of the other aspects as well, multidisciplinary areas. This map just shows you some of the primary areas where our cases are being investigated. So you can see this is quite a large swath of the South, and that kind of makes sense. And here, is this your part?
No.
Okay, so we sort of divided this up. We want to make sure we aren't stepping over the different parts. But here is a depiction of some of the research that we've done where we have shown the interrelationship between clans across the Mississippi. So a lot of the work that was done by Klan members in Louisiana was joined by Klan members in Mississippi, and they sort of worked together in that way. And that's something that we shared with authorities in terms of how they ought to look at this. This is a list, and just now, obviously you're not going to be able to read all these names, but just to show you that to the extent that the government has looked at these issues, some of the advocacy groups like the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Urban League, did begin to compile a list of people whose deaths were considered to be racially motivated and suspicious, and that became a part of the Emmett Till Act, which requires that the Department of Justice and the FBI investigate unsolved cases from the era. Now, we talk about cold cases, and just by definition, cold cases are difficult to resolve. And particularly those involving this kind of scenario, these kind of situations where race is at the heart of them. But there have been successful prosecutions, and this is the thing that continues to motivate us and gives us some encouragement and hope that the cases we're working on can also be successfully prosecuted. But just to give you an idea of some of them, maybe these are names that you might recognize, but Medgar Evers, who was killed, and Byron Della Beckwith, who was killed for prosecuted for his murder. The 4 young girls who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church. Finally, the people responsible for their deaths were brought to justice. James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, the civil rights workers that we were mentioning to you earlier. Again, finally someone brought to justice for their deaths. Charles Moore and Henry D., whom we mentioned to you, and James Ford Seale, and more recently, just in 2010, a former trooper in Alabama for the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was involved in voting rights activism. So just some pictures of some of these perpetrators, James Ford Seale. The Emmett Till Act, and you can talk to us later about what some of these provisions are, but Congress enacted this statute and provided resources for the Department of Justice and the FBI to create special units to handle these cold cases. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the updates about our work.
Just quickly, we mentioned earlier that sometimes you find it in a newspaper, just a paragraph or so about somebody's disappearance. Well, Joseph Edwards disappeared in July, a little before Frank Morris was killed. And we started asking questions about his disappearance, and we connected with his sister, Julia Dobbins. He disappeared in '64. He happened to have the misfortune of working as a porter in a motel that was the Klan headquarters of that area. They all met, and they met with the law enforcement. And he disappeared and has never been heard from since. Well, when we started asking about him, they said they didn't have any records. The FBI didn't have any records, Justice Department didn't. But our students went to DC in the summer, one of the years, and we found 7,000 documents in the National Archives Annex of material that was supposed to be on the Warless Jackson bombing, the truck bombing that Professor Johnson referred to. But within it, it had a lot of material about the not only disappearance, but the murder investigation of, for Joseph Edwards. So we took it to the U.S. Attorney and said, what about this? you know, and it took us 3 years to get this man's name on the FBI's cold case list. It's one of the only ones they've added on the list. And so we work with the families, we help them from that perspective. Now, the Frank Morris case, we got together the FBI folks. There's a picture there of Cynthia Deedle, the chief of the Civil Rights Unit of the FBI, and the Assistant Attorney General. We've met with the Attorney General in both administrations and have asked them to push these cases, and we keep giving them more information that our students have found and that we've assimilated. That is an agent for constant pressure on them to do the right thing. So in the Morris case, they vowed to work together. Whoops. And what happened in late 2010 and early 2011 is that through some of the material that we did, and in combination with Stanley Nelson at the Concordia Sentinel, we were able to locate an individual whose family members admitted to us, and we're going to show you that, not to us, but to Stanley Nelson, that there's a video that shows the interviews with the ex-brother-in-law, the ex-wife, and the son of one individual said, yeah, I was there. They had told him all along as the son was growing up, as he was with his wife and brother-in-law, that, yeah, I participated as one of the clan on the wrecking crews that were asked to come into Faraday and to burn down that store. And this guy happened to be there, and, well, we didn't expect him there. We weren't trying to murder him, but since he was there, we threw gas on him and lit a match, and he died. So he had admitted it years ago. Now, one of these guys is a deputy sheriff, his brother-in-law, who never revealed it until now. So what we tried to show you, and you can look up under coldcases.org, the actual video of the guy who says, nah, I was in the Klan, but I didn't do that. He doesn't admit it. His brother-in-law, his ex-wife, his son, who all say, yeah, Daddy told us about this all the time. So this is part of the work that we've done, and right now there's a grand jury that's been sitting ever since that story came out. The Justice Department didn't want us to have the story come out, but once it came out, the grand jury was convened. It's been sitting for a year. It's hearing evidence, but why a year? We don't know. We don't know why it's taking so long when you have that many people who can testify that this guy was part of it. There should be an indictment, and so we're still pushing on that.
Okay, so at this point, we also want you to hear some other voices, and as I talk about this program, I'm going to ask Jameli and Jonathan to come up and say a few words to you as well. So you all want to come on up to the stage? As they come, okay, we're just going to take a couple of minutes. As they come up, let me just tell you what this image is. We had a retreat for family members in Atlanta in 2010, and a number of our students helped us organize this as well. But it was a chance for family members who had lost someone in their family in a killing such as this to meet. And some of them had not talked about the deaths since they had happened. And so they had an opportunity to meet with each other in a safe space and talk about that. And then we had an open forum, and this is in Ebenezer Baptist Church, as you know, Dr. King's church. And there was a forum where the public could come in, and this is showing some of the panels, and some of these are family members on the panels. Now, I want to have some of the students talk to you now, and Jonathan Hoven and Jameli Tanui, who can talk about their involvement with CCJI.
Hi, I'm John. Okay, I'm gonna do last summer. What I did in the summer? Yeah. Okay. This past summer, I was given an internship with CCJI. It kind of had two parts to it. There was the firm part where, I was placed in the offices of Paul Hastings. It's one of the biggest law firms in the world. They have an office in every major city of the world. So, as someone who wants to work in a firm like that someday, that was an amazing opportunity. Just from a legal standpoint. when I go and interview for jobs now, that's the first thing that they want to talk to me about. Talk to me about your experience at Paul Hastings. What was that like? So that's an amazing thing to have on my resume now. And the other part of it was the research I did for Cold Case. I did legal research on a couple of cases we were working on at the time. And I also started building a database of cases in Georgia and really across the South. What I did is I went to the Library of African American History in Atlanta, and I spent a lot of time in the archives going through a publication called the Atlanta Daily World, which was one of the first and at its time only black publications in the country. And in the Atlanta Daily World, they would cover stories from all across the South, and the pattern is, the pattern is unbelievable. You see it time and time again when I would read through these stories. You have an African American person who's accused of murder or who's accused of rape, and they go into an all-white jury who convicts them. Or in the reverse, you have a victim, a black victim, and an all-white grand jury says it was a justifiable homicide, or one of many different reasons that came up time and time again. One of the other things I noticed that was huge is the Atlanta. You wouldn't believe the number of police shootings, white police officers shooting black victims, and those time and time again are ruled justifiable homicide, or the victim was found with a knife on their person. Now, I certainly wouldn't attack somebody who was holding a gun with a knife. Just very suspicious circumstances, and the names of coroners, the names of judges appear again and again and again. And, the institutional racism, it's just unbelievable, and reading it in the paper day after day was quite an experience. I had a great experience with CCJI. We're continuing to work on the cases now, and I would encourage anybody who's interested to get involved, because it's very rewarding, both legally and at a personal level.
Because we're running out of time, I work with John on the archive project, and it's really been a wonderful experience. I got involved because I'm a foreigner in this country, and like most people, you come into America thinking, oh, the civil rights came through, people are equal, this is the land of opportunity and equality and justice for all. And within 1 week of living in this country, I realized, it's not quite that way. And part of my frustration, and one of the reasons I really wanted to be in this program, was there seems to be a lot of complacency. People seem just satisfied to let things be, don't stir up trouble. And I met a woman in San Diego where I went for my undergraduate program who had scars all down her throat because she got beat during the civil rights marches in the South. And she was so peaceful, and I kept thinking, why are you all there is no justice. I mean, the Nazis get tried, the war tribunals keep going on around the world. This is the greatest country for freedom, and I don't see as if anything is being done for all those people who've been killed. And then I came to Syracuse, and I heard about these crazy professors who are taking on this huge, giant institution of racism, and I thought, this is great, and this is what really drew me, is instead of being angry and sad and just sitting there thinking, my goodness, so we just keep moving forward, and all these poor families who have all these horrible things that have happened to them, and nobody will ever apologize to them. In fact, even where there were real defendants who were identified, nothing was going to ever be done. And from the first news stories of the first people who started getting prosecuted and convicted, you just get this excitement, this rush, not because we're not ready to move forward, but because you can't move forward if you don't acknowledge the injustices of the past. And so I'd encourage all of you to just volunteer an hour or two, and you'll feel good.
Say one more thing.
Okay.
I just want to say one more thing about the effort to identify the victims. Nobody has ever identified how many victims there really were during the civil rights era. There has never been a full-scale effort to ask the question, who disappeared and how many were killed? The Justice Department isn't asking that question, the FBI isn't asking that question, local law. We are taking that on and trying to push that, and won't stop really until we can do that.
And so this is our last image, and we just want to sort of end with this. I mean, you know, sort of the why we do this work, in addition to what Jameli and Jonathan have just shared with you. And this is 3 generations of the Worless Jackson family. Worless Jackson Sr., as we mentioned to you, was killed in a bombing. His truck was bombed. He was the first African American to take a skilled position at the Armstrong Tire and Rubber Company in Natchez, Mississippi in 1967. And he was told that if he took that job, he would be killed. And in fact, he was killed as a result of that. And the bomb went off. It was detonated right in the middle of the black community. This is his son, Worless Jackson Jr., and his niece, and another niece's son. So these are 3 generations of the Jackson family, and still no one has been brought to justice for the killing of their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. And so we continue to do this work on behalf of families like theirs, on behalf of them in particular, and on behalf of the issues that pertain to our society and justice, not only in this country, but internationally. So with that, we want to conclude and thank you for your attention. If we have a few moments, we'd be happy to hear any comments or questions that you all might have. But thank you very much.
Questions? Be brave. Nobody? Wow. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And a question. Go ahead.
I just had a quick question as far as PR. I see your website's on there. I haven't checked it out yet. Do you have a lot of information online? For example, if I wanted to send it out to my friends who are working in, high schools or middle schools with students, do you have a lot of information online? And are there students that would be willing to be interviewed or to talk to students at universities and colleges that are working on projects of this nature?
We do have a website. The website, it's listed here. It has a lot of information on it. It's constantly being updated. We do speak to colleges and universities around the country. We have in the past, and so we're glad to talk to anyone. We don't want people just to go out and start investigating on their own. We think this is something that needs skill and sensitivity, so we do encourage people to come through some sort of supervision in doing it, but it's that's important. Also, URS 1L is able to volunteer for an hour or 2 a week, and then there are paid internships in the summer, and then students stay on in their 2nd and 3rd year. The internships are at law firms and in locales like Natchez, Mississippi. We've had some in Washington, D.C., here in Syracuse, and in Atlanta. So if you're interested, contact us, contact some of the 1Ls who are involved in it, and we appreciate the support. Thank you.
Well, actually, let me just say, once you get involved in CCJI, we don't let you go. Jameli's actually a 2nd-year student, and Jonathan is a 3rd-year student, and we've had people who've graduated, and they continue to stay in touch with us. So you can get in at the beginning and continue working with us, and we hope that you will do so. Thank you.